Board voted to fire Black CFO without warning. She stood up and showed them who held their shares escort her out, and make sure she returns the badge before she embarrasses herself further. The words landed flat and unhurried, the way a man speaks when he has never once been told no. Richard Harlow did not look at her when he said it. He looked at his fingernails. He sat at the head of the Stratum Capital boardroom table, a table that ran 16 feet of solid cherry wood and reflected the downtown Chicago skyline in its polish. And he examined his fingernails as if the woman across from him were a smudge on the window, something maintenance would handle. The other 6 board members were very still. Margaret Chen, at the far end, pressed her lips together. Thomas Vickers studied his legal pad. The 2 men beside him found something significant happening in the middle distance. The young assistant, standing near the door, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, holding a plastic storage bin, because Richard Harlow had sent someone for her badge before the meeting had technically finished. Only the woman at the center seat did not move. Celeste Adeyemi sat with her hands resting open on the table, her spine straight, her face composed into something that was not quite calm and not quite anger, and was instead the third thing, the thing that comes after you have spent a very long time learning that the first 2 are luxuries you cannot afford. She was 41 years old. She was wearing a charcoal blazer she had owned for 11 years and had learned to press herself because the dry cleaners near her mother's apartment charged $8 a garment. She had a leather portfolio in front of her that she had not opened since the meeting began because she had not needed it yet. She's a DEI hire with a finance degree, Richard continued, addressing the room as though Celeste were not sitting 6 feet away. The numbers don't lie. The Q3 gap, the Westfield restructuring miss, the Dominion hedge, all on her watch. The board has already reviewed the summary I circulated. He finally looked at her then. His expression was patient and faintly entertained, the way a man looks when he is about to explain something to someone he has already decided cannot understand it. He had the particular ease of a man who has been given the benefit of every doubt since the age of 7, and who has long since stopped noticing it. Celeste, you've had a good run. It's time to let the adults take the wheel. He did not say it unkindly. That was the part that would stay with the people in that room the longest. He said it the way you might tell a housekeeper that her services are no longer required, with a kind of impersonal finality that communicated, more clearly than contempt would have, that he had never considered her an equal. Not once. Not for a single morning in 5 years. But Richard Harlow had just made the most expensive mistake of his 40-year career, because the woman he had told to leave, the woman he had filed a termination notice on, without so much as a phone call, without a conversation, without the professional courtesy of a warning he would have extended without thinking to any one of the pale-faced men who had rotated through Stratum's finance chair before her, she held something in that leather portfolio that was going to change the temperature of that room in less than 20 minutes, and she had been waiting 7 months to open it. Nah, he really called her a DEI hire to her face, in a boardroom, with witnesses, and then sent a man with a plastic bin for her badge like she was a mailroom contractor who'd been let go. Hold on. We need to go all the way back, because you need to understand exactly who Celeste Adeyemi is before we talk about what happened next. Let's get into it. Celeste Adeyemi grew up in Roseland, on the far south side of Chicago, in a 2-bedroom apartment on 111th Street where the radiator knocked through. The night like something trying to get out. The windows sweated in winter. The linoleum in the kitchen had a long crack running from the refrigerator to the back wall that her mother had covered with a strip of duct tape every year since Celeste was 6. The hallway outside the bathroom had a water stain on the ceiling that changed shape depending on the season, and Celeste had spent enough time studying it as a child that she could have drawn it from memory, the way some children can draw constellations. Her mother, Gloria, worked a split shift, days at a commercial laundry facility on Halsted, evenings clerking at the currency exchange 2 blocks over on Michigan Avenue. She came home smelling of industrial detergent and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been standing for 12 hours and knows she will be standing again in the morning. She did not complain. She was not a woman built for complaint. She cooked dinner with whatever was in the cabinet, packed Celeste's lunch, using the heels of the bread loaf, because the middle slices needed to last, and sat at the kitchen table, After Celeste was in bed to study the bus route changes for the next day's schedule, so she did not miss a connection. Celeste's father had left when she was 6, not dramatically, not with a scene or a door slamming, but in the way of slow disappearances, fewer calls, then no calls, then a Christmas card from Memphis that stopped arriving around the time Celeste turned 9. What he left behind was a wooden index card box. On each card, in a schoolteacher's careful handwriting, he had written a financial concept: compound interest, amortization, net present value, arbitrage, liquidity premium. The box sat on the kitchen shelf between the sugar canister and a photograph of Celeste's grandmother in her church hat, and Celeste had worked through every card before she finished 4th grade. She would read them after homework, back to front to back, turning each one over as though there might be something on the other side she had missed. There was not. The explanations were brief and exact. He had written them for a child to understand. She had been, without quite knowing it, reading the only letters he ever wrote her. Gloria Adeyemi was not a woman who used many words to communicate love. She communicated it through pressed uniforms and packed lunches, through library card renewals and bus passes folded into Celeste's coat pocket every Monday morning, through showing up to every academic event in her laundry shift clothes. Because she could not afford to own 2 sets of clothes that looked different from each other, and she refused to miss a single one. She drove Celeste to the academic decathlon regionals in a borrowed Oldsmobile with a cracked dashboard that leaked cold air all the way to Evanston, and she sat in the back of the auditorium and pressed both large, quiet hands flat against her sternum the entire time Celeste was at the front of the room, as if she needed to hold the pride inside her body before it escaped through her mouth. Celeste finished first in the state that year in mathematics. The next year, she finished first again. The year after that, she was recruited to represent Illinois in the national competition in Washington, D.C. Gloria borrowed $200 from her sister to buy Celeste a blazer for the trip. Celeste won. The blazer lasted 4 more years before it wore through at the elbows, and by then Celeste had learned to find good ones at the thrift shop in Wicker Park. She attended Whitney Young on a merit scholarship, then the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign on a full academic award, then the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, where she completed her MBA with a concentration in corporate finance while working 20 hours a week at a Loop accounting firm to cover the gap her scholarships did not reach. She lived in a studio apartment in Hyde Park, where the window in the bedroom looked out on an air shaft, and the heat came and went according to its own logic. She studied at the kitchen table with a blanket over her shoulders in winter and a box fan in the window in summer, and she did not fall below a 3.9 GPA in any semester of her MBA program. Her thesis was a 140-page analysis of capital misallocation in mid-market private equity vehicles with a specific focus on the divergence between reported IRR and modified IRR in funds with significant GP fee extraction. Her faculty advisor submitted it to the Journal of Financial Economics without telling her. It was published the spring before she graduated. She found out about the publication from a classmate who had seen it listed in a database, and she went back to her apartment and sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the printout in front of her before she called her mother. She did not know it then, but that thesis would matter very specifically in about 11 years. She entered private equity as an analyst at a mid-sized fund on Michigan Avenue, moved to senior associate within 18 months, and was recruited to Stratum Capital as vice president of financial strategy at 33. She was, at the time of her VP hire, the only black woman in a professional role at the fund above the administrative level. She was aware of this. She was also aware, from her first week, that at least 2 of the partners had not been in favor of her hire, and that they would be watching her in the specific way. People watch something they are hoping will fail. At 36, she was promoted to CFO after managing the Hartwell portfolio restructuring that had pulled a logistics company out of covenant breach in 11 months. The promotion had not been unanimous. Richard Harlow had advocated for an external candidate, a man named Grant Ellison, who had spent his career at a bulge bracket advisory firm and who had, Celeste later learned, played golf with Richard at the same country club for 15 years. The board had voted 4-3 for Celeste. She knew the count. She knew who had voted which way. She had noted it and filed it and gone back to work. Stratum Capital managed approximately $4.2 billion in assets under management. It was a mid-market fund with a reputation for operational discipline and a portfolio that included logistics companies, regional healthcare networks, a specialty chemicals manufacturer, and a distressed real estate vehicle in the fund's lower-tier portfolio that Celeste had restructured from near insolvency into the fund's top-performing asset over 14 months. That restructuring was the reason Stratum's institutional investors had renewed their LP commitments in the prior cycle. It was also the reason Richard Harlow had given Celeste a perfunctory congratulatory email rather than a public acknowledgement at the annual LP presentation, and had twice in the following year referred to the restructuring in investor materials without mentioning her name. She had noted that too. She had filed it. She had gone back to work. Celeste had 3 analysts on her direct team. She mentored 2 of them intensively, both young black women from state schools who had not come up through the usual pipeline of Target University recruiting. She had advocated for both their hires against the kind of quiet procedural resistance that does not leave fingerprints. Concerns about cultural fit, questions about whether their school's program was rigorous enough, a suggestion that the fund might want to wait for the next recruiting cycle when there might be stronger candidates. She had pushed through each objection, specifically and patiently, and she tracked both analysts' performance reviews herself to make sure the numbers were being read honestly, and not through the filter that sometimes got applied to work, produced by people who were not expected to produce it. She had not told those analysts what she was doing with the 7 months since March. She had not told Marcus, her COO and the closest thing she had to an ally inside Stratum's leadership structure. She had not told Thomas Vickers, whose fiduciary instincts she respected more than she respected most people in the building. She had not told anyone. She had been holding the information since the morning she sat in her attorney's office in the West Loop and signed the last set of documents while rain came down the window glass and her attorney said very quietly, "Celeste, do you understand what you now own?" She understood. She had gone back to her office afterward and ordered soup from the deli on Wacker Drive and eaten it at her desk while reviewing the Westfield projections, and she had not said a word. That was in March. It was now October. The boardroom meeting had been called with 48 hours' notice. The agenda listed it simply as a quarterly performance review. Celeste had prepared for a performance review. She had her Q3 numbers, her variance analysis, her forward guidance through year-end, and a deck built on 3 weeks of data work. She had not expected to walk into a termination proceeding, but she had, as it turned out, brought the right portfolio. The boardroom was on the 44th floor of a building in the Loop whose lobby still had the original brass elevator doors from 1928, the kind of doors that moved slowly and deliberated about it, that made a sound like something settling into place. Celeste had loved those doors since the first time she walked through this building as a Stratum interviewee. She had been 29 years old, and she had stood outside on the Wacker Drive sidewalk for 2 full minutes before going in, looking up at the building's stone face and then at the revolving door. And she had thought about the radiator on 111th Street and the index cards in the wooden box and her mother in the back of the auditorium with her hands pressed to her chest, and then she had gone in. She took the elevator to 44 at 8:53 that morning. The assistant at the reception desk, a woman named Patricia, who had been at Stratum longer than Richard Harlow, and who knew every version of every meeting that had been called in this building, gave her a look that lasted half a second longer than usual. Patricia's eyes moved to the boardroom door and back to Celeste's face. The look was the kind that carries information in the negative space. Not what it says, but what it does not say. The information held back by professional loyalty and the calculation of risk. Celeste registered it. She thanked Patricia and walked down the hall and opened the boardroom door. 7 board members were already seated. The CFO's chair, the chair at the head of the table that she had occupied every boardroom meeting for 5 years, had been removed. There was no nameplate. There was no water glass. There was a single chair positioned at the center of the long side of the table, facing the head, the way chairs are positioned for people who are there to answer questions rather than ask them. She sat down in it. She set her portfolio on the table. She folded her hands. She looked at Richard Harlow and waited. He opened by distributing a 4-page document. The document cited 3 items as the basis for the termination: the Q3 revenue variance, the Westfield restructuring timeline extension, and what he called the Dominion hedge exposure. He walked through each item in summary. His tone was measured and sympathetic, in the way of a man who has rehearsed sympathy and gotten it slightly wrong. The words in the right order, but the weight misplaced. He said performance gaps. He said fiduciary obligation of the board. He said the difficult decision that leadership sometimes must make. He said, toward the end, that he wanted to acknowledge Celeste's contributions to the fund before they concluded, and he said it with the particular emphasis of someone who believes that acknowledgement and dismissal can be delivered in the same sentence, and that the acknowledgement softens the dismissal, not understanding that for the person on the receiving end it does the opposite. Celeste read the document. She read it carefully. She looked up from the second page and set it face down on the table. Margaret Chen had said nothing. Her pen was moving slowly across her legal pad. She was writing the word no in progressively larger letters. Because Margaret Chen had arrived at this meeting, believing it was a quarterly performance review, and because she had voted against this motion at the pre-meeting, she had not been told was a termination proceeding until she sat down, and because Richard Harlow had just characterized the vote as unanimous when it had been 5-2. Thomas Vickers was studying his legal pad. His face was the face of a man who has participated in enough institutional processes to know when a process has been structured incorrectly and who is at this moment performing the specific calculation of how much he knew in advance and how implicated that knowledge makes him. David Okafor was looking at his phone under the table. He was 29 years old and had joined the board 8 months prior as the fund's designated independent director. He had voted for the termination motion because Richard Harlow had sent him a pre-meeting summary that said the motion had broad board support and that the financial documentation was conclusive, and because David Okafor had not yet learned that conclusive is what documents are called when someone needs you to believe them without reading them. The other 3 men had voted for the termination. 2 of them were looking at the table. The third, a man named Greg Paulson, who had been on the board for 11 years, was looking at Celeste with an expression of professional regret so practiced it had become indistinguishable from genuine feeling. The young man with the plastic bin was still standing near the door. Celeste looked at the bin. She looked at Richard. She looked at the 6 other members of the board of directors of Stratum Capital Partners, LLC. She thought about the 48-hour notice meeting. She thought about the chair that had been removed. She thought about the summary document with its selective excerpts and its incorrect Dominion notation and its conclusion drawn before the evidence was assembled. She thought about the 11 years she had spent in this building, pressing the same blazer. She thought about her mother in the back of the auditorium. She opened her portfolio. Okay, wait. That plastic bin. He sent someone with a plastic bin before she had even spoken a word, before anyone in that room had asked her a single question. A man walked in with a plastic bin to collect her badge, like she was already gone, like the decision was so settled that the retrieval of her property was already in motion. You need to feel the deliberateness of that. That was not an administrative oversight. That was a message, and what Celeste pulled out of that portfolio was about to respond to that message in a language Richard Harlow had spent his entire career assuming only he knew how to speak. Stay with me. Inside the portfolio were 3 documents, printed that morning at 6:45 in her home office, while it was still dark, and the city outside her window was making its early morning sounds. Buses gearing up on Lake Shore Drive, the first gulls over the water, the radiator ticking in the hallway in the same register as the radiator she had fallen asleep to on 111th Street. The first document was a 17-page ownership disclosure statement, prepared by her attorney, and certified by a third-party auditing firm whose name appeared in the fund's own governance documents as an approved, independent verifier. The second document was a table of shareholder records, cross-referenced with the Stratum Capital Partnership Agreement and the fund's LLC operating agreement, annotated at specific clauses that had been flagged by outside legal review. The third document was a single page. It had 2 numbers on it. One was a percentage. The other was a dollar figure with 9 digits. She did not open any of them yet. She set them on the table. 3 neat documents in a row, and she looked at Richard Harlow and she said, "Before we proceed with the termination, I need the board to confirm the vote count and the basis for the unanimous characterization, because at least one member of this board has indicated to me that characterizations does not reflect the actual vote." Margaret Chen looked up from her legal pad. Richard said, "This isn't a debate, Celeste. The board has made its. I understand the board has made a decision," Celeste said. "I'm asking about the accuracy of the vote count as stated. Unanimous has a specific meaning in the context of the fund's governance documents, and if the vote was not unanimous, then the record of this proceeding should reflect the actual count." There was a pause. It was the kind of pause that has texture. Richard Harlow was 63 years old and had managed institutional capital for 4 decades and sat at the head of enough tables that he had stopped being aware of the power of the position, the way people who have always been warm stop noticing the warmth. The particular quality of that pause was the quality of a man being asked, in front of witnesses, to say something true that he had preferred to leave ambiguous. 5-2, he said. Margaret and David were in the minority. He said minority with an inflection that made it mean something adjacent to wrong. "Thank you," Celeste said. "I'd like that reflected in the record." She picked up the first document and slid it across the table to Thomas Vickers. She chose Thomas because Thomas was the board's fiduciary officer and because she knew he would recognize what he was holding before he finished the first page, and because a man whose professional identity is built around his reputation for rigor does not sit on documentation that complicates a proceeding he has just participated in. Thomas put on his half-rimmed glasses. He looked at the first page. He turned to the second. He turned to the third. He found the percentage on the bottom of the third page, and he read it twice, and he went very still. He did not say anything immediately. He turned back to the first page, verified the certification stamp, found the auditor's signature block, checked the date. He turned back to the percentage. Then he set the document down on the table in front of him and did something his hands almost never did in this room. They paused completely, both of them flat on the document, not moving. "Richard," Thomas said. Just that. He did not say anything else. He slid the document laterally down the table. Richard picked it up. He read the first page. He read the second. He read the third. He found the percentage. His face did what faces sometimes do when they receive information the mind is not ready to process. It simply stopped organizing itself. The expression he had been wearing, the patient, entertained expression, the expression of a man managing a situation, it went blank for 3 full seconds. And in that blankness, if you were paying attention, you could see the precise moment when the room changed. Celeste Adeyemi owned 31.4% of Stratum Capital Partners, LLC. She had acquired it over 7 months, through a series of secondary market purchases, structured through a holding company her attorney had established 18 months prior, registered under a name that bore no visible connection to her own. She had used the proceeds of a real estate transaction, a property she had purchased distressed in 2017 at a bank auction for $68,000, a 2-flat in Woodlawn that had stood vacant for 4 years and whose rear porch had been condemned, to fund the initial tranches. She had renovated it over 4 years in her nights and weekends using skills her Uncle Darnell had taught her in his garage in Roseland. Framing, drywall, tile work, the patient attention to materials that her uncle called listening to the house. She had sold it in 2021 at a gain that left her attorney briefly speechless and said, over the phone, that she should come in as soon as possible. The later tranches had been funded from her compensation and by a private credit facility secured against her personal balance sheet, arranged through a community bank in Hyde Park, whose loan officer had asked her, during the application meeting, what she planned to do with the capital. She had said, without elaboration, that she was making an investment in something she believed in. The loan officer, a woman who had grown up in Bronzeville and who knew a certain kind of answer when she heard one, had approved the facility. The fund's governance documents required a supermajority vote of 67% of ownership interests to terminate a named officer. Richard Harlow's largest single ownership block was 18.2%. Assembled over 2 decades and representing the dominant LP position he had always used to maintain control of major fund decisions. The combined ownership of the 5 board members who had voted for termination was 51.3%. They needed 67. They did not have 67. They were not close to 67. There was not a version of the arithmetic that produced 67. Celeste watched Richard do the math. She watched him do it a second time. She watched him look at the document as though the numbers might change if he kept looking, the way you keep pressing an elevator button that isn't working, because the action feels better than accepting the reality. This is, he started. Verified and certified, she said. You have the auditor's stamp on page 4. The holding company's beneficial ownership disclosure is on page 9. The secondary market purchase confirmations are pages 11 through 17. The transactions are complete, the record is clean, and the percentage is accurate as of 6:45 this morning. She paused. I can give the board time to have legal counsel review the documentation, but I want to note that the termination motion, as voted, does not meet the supermajority threshold required by the fund's operating agreement. She let that settle. Richard set the document on the table. His hand moved away from it slowly, the way you move your hand away from a hot surface, careful and deliberate, as though the care is a form of dignity. At the far end of the table, Margaret Chen pressed both hands flat on the tabletop. I need to state for the record, she said, and her voice was measured and clear, the voice of someone who has decided what they are willing to have documented. That I voted against the termination motion, that I was not informed this meeting was a termination proceeding, until I arrived this morning, and that the characterization of the vote as unanimous was inaccurate. David Okafor put his phone face down on the table. Thomas Vickers said, the termination motion fails for lack of supermajority. The motion is void. He said it without qualification, without uncertainty, with the specific authority of a man stating a conclusion that has been forced on him, by math and by documentation and by the particular discipline, that a career in fiduciary governance requires you to maintain even when the conclusion is uncomfortable. The room was very quiet. The Chicago River was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bending east toward the lake in the October light. A water taxi moved under the bridge. A plane crossed the sky in the far distance, trailing white. The city did what cities do, which is to continue regardless of what is happening on any given floor of any given building, because the city has 44 floors of this going on at any given moment and has learned not to take sides. But Celeste was not finished. Man, 31.4%. Built in 7 months, in silence, through a holding company no one knew about, while she was still showing up to this building every morning, pressing her blazer, doing her job at the highest level, absorbing everything Richard threw at her without a single visible reaction. That is not luck, that is architecture. That is someone who understood from the beginning that the room she was in was not built for her, and who decided to buy the building. But wait, because the ownership disclosure was not even the most significant thing in that portfolio. Stay with me. While the board was still processing the document, while Richard Harlow was still sitting with his hands away from the page he had just set down, Celeste opened the second component of what she had brought, a USB drive, which she stood to plug into the boardroom's presentation input at the end of the table, and a remote presenter she took from her portfolio pocket, and she walked back to her seat and pressed the first button. The screen at the end of the room came on. It was a screen she had sat facing for 5 years, in quarterly reviews and LP presentations and annual strategy meetings, a screen she had walked to with a clicker in her hand to present fund form performance to institutional investors who had committed hundreds of millions of dollars partly on the basis of her analysis. She knew the screen well. She knew the angle of the light from the windows in the afternoon and how it washed out the left side if you did not close the shade. She had always closed the shade before her presentations. She had not closed it today. The first item on the screen was an email thread. It was dated 14 months earlier. It began with a message from Richard Harlow to 3 board members. Not the full board. 3. Discussing what Richard called the narrative challenge of the upcoming Q3 cycle. The thread developed over 4 exchanges. By the 4th exchange, the phrase performance attribution had appeared several times, and what it was being used to describe was a process of allocating financial underperformance to specific line items in ways that the quarterly reporting would not necessarily make traceable. The second item on the screen was a capital transfer authorization, signed by Richard Harlow, dated 6 months prior. It documented the redirection of approximately $4.3 million from the Westfield vehicle operating account to a holding position associated with a personal real estate obligation. This was the redirection that had extended the Westfield restructuring timeline by 6 weeks. This was the timeline extension that the termination summary had cited as Celeste's failure. The Westfield portfolio company's own CFO had flagged the capital gap in a memo to Celeste in the month it occurred. Celeste had investigated it, found the authorization trail, and filed a written notation in the fund's document management system in which she identified the source of the delay and noted that the extension was not attributable to the restructuring plan she had designed. That notation was on the screen. The third item was the Dominion Hedge closing confirmation, dated August 14th, signed by Celeste, showing a net realized gain of approximately $2.1 million on a position that the termination summary had described as an open exposure. The confirmation was on the screen. The date was on the screen. Richard Harlow's name appeared nowhere on the confirmation. Because Richard Harlow had not been involved in the Dominion position, Celeste had managed it entirely. The fourth item was the Q2 board meeting minutes, showing the fee structure change that had been approved by a unanimous board vote in the spring. Beside it, in a document labeled Dissent Memo, CFO, dated 4 days before that board meeting, was Celeste's written objection to the fee structure change, in which she had projected a Q3 revenue variance of between 8 and 11%, and had requested that the board consider a phased implementation. The memo had been filed, acknowledged, and not acted upon. The Q3 variance, when it arrived, had been 9.4%, exactly within her projected range. Richard said, "Where did you get those?" Not as a question, as something else. "From the fund's document management system," Celeste said. "I have CFO-level access to the document management system. I have had it for 5 years. I reviewed these documents this week as part of my preparation for today's meeting." She paused. "I also have the recording." The recording had been made in this same boardroom 9 days earlier, during a meeting Celeste had not been invited to. She had not been in the room. What she had been was the person responsible for the building's AV infrastructure vendor contract, a responsibility she had taken on 18 months ago, when the prior vendor's contract expired, and no one else had been willing to manage the renewal process. Because managing vendor contracts is not glamorous work, and the people in this building who were not required to do unglamorous work had generally declined it. The boardroom's recording system was set to retain session footage for 30 days. It operated under her vendor agreement. The footage was accessible to the contract administrator. She was the contract administrator. She pressed the second button on the remote. The recording showed Richard Harlow at the head of the boardroom table, with 3 board members seated around him, the lights on, the shades drawn, no agenda posted on the system for the session. Richard was speaking. His voice was clear. The room's acoustic treatment was very good. He said, in the recording, that the Q3 numbers would need to be framed carefully in the board summary. He said that the Westfield notation could be written to point to leadership decisions at the portfolio company rather than at the GP level. He said that Dominion was something they could characterize as an unresolved exposure if the language was imprecise enough. He said that the goal was to make the termination summary hold up to at least 48 hours of scrutiny before anyone with detailed knowledge of the fund's operations could contest it, because by that point the termination would be complete. And then he said something else. He said that the DEI pressure from the LP Advisory Committee, and by this he meant the pressure that had resulted in Celeste's hire and promotion, had run its course, and that the institutional investor climate had shifted enough that a quiet termination of a diversity initiative hire would not draw the kind of LP response it might have 2 years ago. He said the phrase diversity initiative hire with the specific casualness of a man who uses a phrase often enough that he has stopped noticing what it contains. One of the 3 board members in the recording said, to make sure, the performance justification needs to be airtight before she walks out of that meeting. Richard said, it does not need to be airtight. It needs to be adequate. She does not have the resources to contest it, and by the time she retains counsel, we'll have moved on. The recording ended. The boardroom was extremely quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight. The kind that presses down on people and makes them aware of where their hands are and what their faces are doing. Greg Paulson, the board member with the practiced expression of professional regret, was no longer maintaining the expression. He was looking at the wall. The two men beside him were very still in the way of men who are calculating, backward, re-examining things they had said in private, trying to determine what else might be on a recording somewhere. Richard Harlow was looking at the screen. The recording had ended, but the last frame was still there. Richard at the head of the table, and the image of him on screen in that frame was almost exactly aligned with the image of him at the head of the table now, and if you sat in the right chair, you could see them both at the same time. And the comparison was not flattering to the present version. He opened his mouth once, he closed it. He looked at the table. Celeste said, "I'm going to recommend that the board recess for legal consultation. I want to note that I have been advised not to make any representations about my intentions with respect to this recording or the documentation on the screen until that consultation has occurred. I would also note that my analyst team has a copy of each document, time-stamped and filed with the fund's outside auditor as of 7:15 this morning." She stood. She picked up her portfolio. She buttoned the middle button of her charcoal blazer. She walked toward the door. She stopped. She turned back to the young man with the plastic bin, who had been standing against the wall for the last 30 minutes, in the specific posture of someone who very much wishes they were somewhere else. "The badge stays with me," she said. She walked out. "Hold on. I need you to sit with that for a second. The badge stays with me." Delivered without elevation, without satisfaction showing on her face. No gloating, no raised voice, no moment of savoring. Just that sentence. Like she was closing a parenthesis that had been open for 5 years. The woman who grew up on 111th Street, who rode the red line to her own interview at 29, who pressed the same blazer for 11 years. She had been building toward that sentence for 7 months. She delivered it like she was checking the last item off a list, and then she walked out to her office, which still had her name on the door. Let's talk about what happened to Richard Harlow, and to the men in that recording, and to the fund they had spent 20 years building. Thomas Vickers reached his attorney before the 45-minute recess ended. The general counsel, a woman named Diane Park, who had represented Stratum for 9 years, received a summary of the boardroom events within the hour. Diane Park reviewed the recording description and the ownership documentation, and said a word in her office that her assistant had never heard her use. Then she made 4 calls. The first was to Richard Harlow. The second was to Stratum's fiduciary liability insurer. The third was to Celeste's attorney, to verify the ownership documentation and to understand the parameters of Celeste's position. The fourth was to her own firm partner, to discuss whether representation continued to be appropriate. By 4 o'clock, 2 of the 3 board members, visible in the recording, had contacted personal counsel. The third submitted a written statement to Thomas Vickers, characterizing his role as passive. Thomas Vickers filed a formal complaint with the fund's governance committee, noting the irregular convening of the termination proceeding and the factual inaccuracies in the distributed summary. Greg Paulson sent an email to Celeste that evening that used the phrase "I should have asked more" questions, and which she filed without responding to. Richard Harlow did not communicate with anyone at the fund for 4 days. On the 5th day, through his attorney, he submitted a resignation from the managing partner role. The resignation letter cited a desire to pursue other opportunities. It did not mention Celeste. It did not mention the recording. It mentioned the fund's future growth trajectory and expressed confidence in the team's ability to continue delivering value. It was 15 sentences long and contained nothing that was either true or interesting. The board required a statement before the resignation would be formally accepted. It was delivered in the same boardroom 2 weeks later. Richard Harlow stood at the end of the table, not the head. The room had been rearranged and read from a document that Diane Park and the fund's general counsel and 2 outside attorneys had spent 3 days negotiating. He called Celeste, a dedicated and highly capable financial executive whose contributions to the fund have been significant. He described his conduct in the pre-meeting as inappropriate and not reflective of the fund's stated values. He said both sentences looking at the document. He said them with the mechanical clarity of a man reading a weather report for a city he does not live in. He said them in a room with 7 witnesses, two of whom had voted against the termination motion and were now watching him with the particular attention of people who have been proven right and are allowing themselves exactly as much satisfaction as is visible. Celeste sat at the center of the table, with her hands resting open, and she let the words land where they landed. She did not offer him anything. When he finished, she said, "Thank you, Richard," and turned to Thomas and said, "Shall we discuss the Q4LP communication strategy?" The two board members from the recording stepped down within 30 days. The third completed a 12-hour governance course and submitted a written acknowledgement to the LP Advisory Committee. Margaret Chen was appointed to the Investment Committee co-chair alongside Thomas Vickers. David Okafor asked for a private meeting with Celeste, sat across from her at the small table in her office, and said that he had voted for the termination because he had trusted the summary without reading the underlying documentation, and that he understood this was not an excuse, and that he wanted to know what he could do. She told him to start by reading every GP summary independently before future votes, and to read the dissent memo she had filed in the spring. He wrote both in his notebook. The institutional consequences moved on their own momentum. Stratum's largest LP, a public pension fund representing $800 million in committed capital, submitted a formal governance inquiry within 72 hours. A regional healthcare portfolio company addressed its Q4 budget review request directly to Celeste by name. A university endowment in preliminary commitment discussions put the conversation on hold pending governance clarification. The November LP presentation was rebuilt around the fund's actual Q3 performance, which, when the variance was correctly attributed to the approved fee structure change rather than misrepresented as CFO error, showed a fund performing within 2 percentage points of its stated benchmark. The settlement with the fiduciary liability insurer was structured over 3 months. Celeste did not publicly discuss its terms. What she did discuss in December at the LP Advisory Committee meeting was the Roseland Capital Access Program. It was a scholarship and professional development pipeline for Black and Latino students from Chicago's South Side, connecting them to careers in private equity and institutional finance. The fund was seeding it with a contribution from the settlement proceeds. Structured as a donor-advised fund with a 10-year commitment and an independent advisory board chaired by a retired Chicago Public Schools economics teacher named Dr. Yolanda Briggs, who had spent 22 years teaching high school economics in Roseland and Englewood, and who had, when Celeste called to ask her to chair the board, been quiet for a long time before saying, "You grew up on a 111th, didn't you?" Celeste had said yes. Dr. Briggs had said, "I taught 2 blocks from there." The first cohort enrolled 7 students, 4 seniors, 3 undergraduates, all from zip codes within 4 miles of where Celeste had grown up. She did not give a speech at the enrollment event. She stood near the back of the room at a community meeting space in Bronzeville and watched the 7 students fill out their program materials and introduce themselves to each other with the particular combination of wariness and hope that belongs to people who have been given something they were not sure would actually exist until they were standing in front of it. At some point during the afternoon, Gloria Adeyemi arrived. Celeste's cousin had driven her from Calumet City, from the bungalow with the porch that did not sag and the kitchen window that looked out on the raised beds where the collard greens had come in thick that fall. Gloria found her daughter near the back wall and stood beside her without saying anything for a long time. They watched the 7 students. They watched Dr. Briggs move through the room with the easy authority of a woman who has spent a career knowing how to make young people feel that their presence matters. Then Gloria reached into her handbag and held something out. One of the index cards. The edges were soft from 40 years of handling. The handwriting was the schoolteacher's careful hand. The word on the card was equity. Celeste held the card. She held it for a long time. Her thumb moved across the letters once. The way you touch something you have not touched in a while, but have never stopped knowing the texture of. Gloria pressed both large, quiet hands flat against her chest and stood that way in the back of the room, watching 7 young people from the south side of Chicago begin the process of entering a world that had spent a long time pretending they did not belong in it. Her face was wet. She did not move her hands. The fund is still operating. Celeste Adeyemi is still its CFO. The 44th floor still looks out on the Chicago River. The lobby still has the brass elevator doors from 1928 that move slowly and make a sound, like something settling into place. She still takes them. She still thinks about what it meant to stand outside this building at 29 years old and look up at it and decide to go in. Her office has a small framed index card on the shelf behind her desk. If you asked about it, she would probably not explain it. She would probably just look at it for a moment, and then look back at you, and continue the conversation. The paper is soft from years of handling. The handwriting belongs to a man who has been gone a long time, and who left, as it turned out, exactly what his daughter needed. The word on the card is equity. She does not explain it to visitors. The math always does that for her. Yo, I need a moment, because this story is fictional. But everything in it, the DEI hire comment delivered like a weather report, the chair removed before the meeting started, the plastic bin, the unanimous vote that wasn't unanimous, the performance gap carefully reframed to point at the woman they wanted gone. None of that is invented. That is Tuesday in this country. That is 1,000 boardrooms. That is the meeting called without notice. The summary circulated before the evidence. The conclusion drawn before the conversation. The assumption that she won't have the resources to contest it. And Celeste's answer to all of it was not a speech. It was not a confrontation. It was 7 months of silence and a leather portfolio and 31.4%. Here is what I want to ask you, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Have you ever been in a room where someone assumed you did not belong there, and known, with complete certainty, that you belonged there more than they did? What did you do with that knowledge? Did you say something? Did you hold it? Did you build something with it? Drop it below. I read every comment and I respond when I can, and this community has taught me more than I expected. If this story hit different today, if you were holding your breath in that boardroom, if you felt something shift when she opened that portfolio, if you want someone in your life to hear this, share it with them. Hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't, because there are more stories coming. Stories about people who were told no and figured out how to make the no irrelevant. Stories about patience as a form of power. Stories about the index card on the shelf that means everything to the person who put it there and nothing to everyone else in the room. This story is fiction. The experience it's built from is not. The mathematics of who gets to hold equity in this country. That's the realest story I know how to tell. We'll see you in the next one.